If you go into the comment section of almost any Ultraman video on social media, there's a good chance you'll find some fans lamenting how the Ultra series just isn't what it used to be. Wishing Tsubudaya Productions would go back to the good old days, 50-episode-long seasons, fully independent storylines, shows with fully original kaiju, and less gimmicky toyetic items. In general, when you look into the Ultraman fandom, there seems to be somewhat of a generational divide on the current state of the franchise, with particular stigma against new generation shows. Even the current heir to the Tsubudaya family, though no longer affiliated with Tsubudaya Productions, Hideaki Tsubudaya went on record in 2018 saying that modern-day Ultra shows have, quote, no spirit anymore, losing their capacity to incorporate messages into the work. It's hard to think of a more scathing indictment than that. But where does this sentiment, both from longtime fans and even previous heads of Tsubudaya Productions, come from? Why is there so much contention around New Generation Ultraman? What even is New Generation Ultraman? You may have seen this term come up both in marketing and within the actual shows themselves. Ultra Galaxy Fight, New Generation Heroes. Ultraman Taiga the movie, New Generation Climax. Those New Generation capsules used in Ultraman Zero Beyond's 2-minute-long transformation sequence in Geed. You know, stuff like that. And so on. Within the context of the Ultraman multiverse, New Generation is a moniker that Ultra heroes from Zero onwards take on, usually only being used in crossovers. Basically, you can think of it like the Ultra equivalent to Kamen Rider's Heisei Phase 2, except sort of bleeding into the Reiwa era as well. As for the real-life and behind-the-scenes meaning, it's a little bit more complicated than that. In order to understand why Ultraman is the way it is now, and why there's such a large divide between old and new, we're gonna need to take a look through Tsubudaya's history as a company and see how the behind-the-scenes developments have affected how their shows have turned out. The 2000s were, to put it lightly, not kind to Tsubudaya Productions. The company had been spiraling deeper and deeper into a financial recession for the first half of this new decade. The first 4 Ultra shows of the Heisei era, Tiga, Daina, Gaia, and Cosmos, while all popular in their own right, were drastically over-budgeted, especially Gaia and Cosmos. The amount that Tsubudaya had to spend to produce these shows landed them in the red and led executives to place strict spending caps on later productions. Despite the creative ambitions that went into it, 2004's Ultra N project failed in both financial and viewership expectations, though admittedly to no fault of its own, leading to the premature cancellation of Nexus while it was airing, and the scrapping of the cinematic sequel to Ultraman the Next. As a result of Nexus's failure, Ultra's TV network at the time, TBS, forced Tsubudaya to produce their next show, Ultraman Max, under severe crunch and with a limited budget. While Max ultimately performed well, it still wasn't enough to reverse the damage from all the losses that the company had continued to take. And on top of this, Tsubudaya had straight up lost the international rights to Ultraman after being mired in a years-long, and more importantly, financially draining legal battle with Chayo Productions. So, when the time came for them to produce their Ultra show of 2006, they decided it would be the end. Ultraman Mebius was made with the intention of being a sort of last hurrah for the company of sorts, celebrating 40 years of Ultra history and giving Tsubudaya Productions one last major project to pour all their resources into. Mebius, like Max, was also a success, but still not enough to turn things around. At over 3 billion yen in debt, with numerous business partners having left them, and now being on the verge of complete bankruptcy, Tsubudaya Productions was no longer able to function as an independent company. For the next several years, Tsubudaya's ownership would switch around between different companies, resulting in some Ultra projects being developed during that time to maintain brand relevance, such as the Mega Monster Battle shows or the Ultraman Zero trilogy of movies. Eventually, 2 companies would end up with joint ownership of Tsubudaya Productions. The first is the Pachinko Company, Fields Corporation, owning 51% of Tsubudaya after their stakes were transferred over from the advertising agency TYO Incorporated. The other, more relevant party to this conversation is Bandai, currently owning the remaining 49% of the company. With Tsubudaya owned by 2 parent companies, all future projects would now be developed under what's called the Production Committee Method. As opposed to a single company producing a show and spearheading a singular creative vision, a production committee, basically a subsidiary of multiple involved corporations, is formed for this purpose. This is how a majority of anime and tokusatsu television is produced in Japan nowadays. With this method, all the corporations overseeing the production get final say as to what the show ends up being like. This brings us to the production of the first new generation Ultra show, Ultraman Ginga, in 2013. Ginga has earned somewhat of a notorious reputation among Ultra fans, mostly for being one of the, if not the single lowest budget mainline Ultra show ever produced. This was because Tsuburaya Productions, despite now having two parent companies, was forced to fund the production of the show entirely on its own. If they wanted actual budgets for future projects, they would need to prove to both Fields and Bandai that Ultraman could still be successful on TV. Going back to the production committee method for a moment, Bandai is a toy company that gets final say as to what gets put into the show. Ginga was the first Ultra show to start focusing heavily on collectible gimmick items within the show itself. Put two and two together, you can probably see where this is going. This made it so that the viability of Ultraman as a franchise was now more intrinsically tied to toy sales than ever before. It was actually Tsuburaya Productions themselves that conceptualized how toys would be integrated into the show through new collectible items called Spark Dolls. These were, in a sense, soft vinyl figurines that would be smaller, and more importantly, cheaper to manufacture than previous figurine toy lines. Within the context of the show itself, these Spark Dolls could be used to transform into or summon Ultras and Kaiju alike, an idea that Bandai particularly liked because of its potential to appeal to both older and newer fans. So, with all these changes, how did Ginga end up faring? At first, pretty poorly. The first half of the show had consistently low viewership ratings, forcing it to go into hiatus. It was actually the Ginga Theater Special, basically the closest thing they had to a tie-in movie at the time, that managed to bring in fresh audiences and get some solid momentum for the show. Ultimately, Ginga and its direct sequel, Ginga S, performed just well enough that both Fields and Bandai were satisfied enough to greenlight future Ultra shows. These two shows would set many of the trends for future Ultra productions to come, both for better and for worse. In a broad sense, new generation shows can be grouped together by certain traits and formulas that they follow. Generally speaking, they're 25-episode long, semi-episodic shows where, since 2016, they tend to feature a multitude of alternate forms for the lead Ultra, numerous references to or appearances from past Ultras and Kaiju, stock footage transformations over green screen, transformation devices that integrate collectible gimmick items, and a stronger sense of interconnected continuity, despite all these shows, with the sole exception of Decker, taking place in their own universes. These aspects tend to be what divide opinions on the shows as a whole, depending on who you ask. Because of how well Taro was received as a returning character in Ginga, other past Ultras were given regular references and appearances because of their perceived marketability. Using stock footage for full transformation sequences instead of real-time transformation scenes helped the production team conserve the filming budget. Kaiju suits were frequently reused because the studio no longer had the funds to create all new designs and costumes for each season. The lack of a defense team for several years was because it was just too costly to afford creating the sets and props for. The increased toyetic nature of the transformation items, collectibles, and weapons kept Bandai executives happy enough to continue supporting production. Over the years, these traits have come to define how many fans look at the current state of Ultraman, a series that keeps its budget low so that it can sell merchandise for maximum profitability. I know how cynical and soulless this must all sound. It can be such a depressing prospect to know that your favorite stories are being controlled by the demands of out-of-touch, greedy higher-ups who only care about profit margins. At its core, Ultraman seems so diametrically opposed to this kind of cynicism that it just feels wrong for it to be made this way. I can't blame older fans or Hideaki Tsuburaya for having so little faith in the current state of the brand when it's so easy to contrast how much more restricted these shows have become compared to 20 years ago. But we've seen what happens when they produce shows purely on ideals without regards for the financial side of things, and it brought down the entire company. Like it or not, the new generation wave production has been incredibly successful for both Tsuburaya and Ultraman as a whole. Since Ginga in 2013, both the profits and budgets of Ultra shows have continued to climb year after year, only bolstered further by Tsuburaya's ongoing international push in the West. This isn't me saying New Generation is better or worse than Heisei. I grew up with Heisei Ultras first and foremost. That's where most of my bias lies. By describing the success of new generation shows, I don't want to come across like I'm defending Bandai here. I dislike them just as much as anyone else in this community. Their involvement shouldn't have to be necessary for Ultra to succeed, but the current reality reflects that. I understand the sentiments of Hideaki Tsuburaya, but I don't fully agree with them. In spite of all the budgetary restrictions and executive meddling, Ultraman is still a labor of love from its production team, as it's always been. Looking through Tsuburaya Productions' history, they've gone through so many periods where the production of their shows were compromised by TV network interference, parental complaints, budget cuts, and so on, but they were still able to persevere through all of those in spite of it all. That was true of older shows like Ace, Leo, 80, Nexus, and Max, and it's absolutely true of current shows too. Adversity drives creativity, and the progression of the skill involved in making these shows has only continued to improve substantially within the past decade because of it. At its core, Ultraman is still able to push the medium of tokusatsu forward with innovations in costume design, cinematography, choreography, and so much more. We've even seen those efforts pay off in major ways, with Ultraman Z beating out box office juggernauts like Demon Slayer to win the Seiyun Award of 2020, becoming the first tokusatsu production to accomplish that since Tokusou Sentai Deca Ranger in 2004. As the new generation era has continued onwards, we've seen the creatives at Tsuburaya push more and more to have their visions put to screen without compromise. Debatably, you can consider this man, Kiyotaka Taguchi, as the one who's spearheading this internal change within the studio. Starting with the production of Ultraman Z in 2020, Taguchi renegotiated the way that Ultra shows were produced at Tsuburaya. For most of New Generation's run, series composition was handled relatively loosely across different writers and directors. Even when a show had a lead director, they would mainly be responsible for their own set of episodes, without much intersecting involvement across creatives. Overarching series scripts were often handled by a team of writers supervised by the production committee and executives. But for Ultraman Z, Taguchi specifically requested that the established script be reworked entirely by himself and one of his colleagues, Kota Fukihara. Considering Z ended up winning that Seiyun Award and became one of the most critically acclaimed series in the past 10 years, evidently that big risk paid off. Taguchi has since encouraged writers and directors for individual episodes to converse with and check each other's work, leading to a stronger sense of continuity and consistent characterization across these stories. He wanted the development cycles of these shows to be good learning experiences where creatives could learn to better each other's techniques and methods, something that even he's benefited from personally. Taguchi is a lifelong fan of tokusatsu, having fallen in love with the medium through Ultra Q and the original Ultraman, and continuing to watch entries from Godzilla, Gamera, and the Ultra series throughout the 90s. He's also the showrunner of the, at the time of this video's upload date, currently ongoing Ultra series, Ultraman Blazar, which is set to be the project where he's been given the most creative freedom thus far. So, what does all of this mean for Blazar? In the lead up to the release of Blazar, there was a lot of speculation from fans about what sort of production or creative changes would entail as part of this new show. The teaser was dark, mysterious, and to some, evoked a similar tone to older shows like Ultraman Nexus. Early leaks revealed that the show would feature more original kaiju suits, less emphasis on toyetic items, and, seemingly, no crossover with past Ultra shows. Some of these discussions ended up creating an expectation that Blazar would somehow be a radical reinvention of the Ultra series, with a grand return to form to the glory days of Heisei. And ultimately, it wasn't really that. But that's completely fine. Blazar isn't a rejection of the new generation, but an evolution of it. Despite what some initial impressions in the marketing might have given off, Blazar still very much follows the production framework of shows from the past 10 years. But what's different, and very important, about Blazar is what it represents for the future of New Generation. While Taguchi himself has stated that he doesn't necessarily see Blazar as a template for future shows, the changes that it's introduced could carry over into later productions if the show's successful. More original kaiju suits, less use of inner space stock footage for transformations, more standalone stories that make for beginner-friendly entry points. The people at Tsuburaya Productions are listening. Starting with the premiere of Blazar, they've put out a feedback survey, asking audiences about their thoughts on recent Ultra shows in general, and what's especially important here, how Blazar stands in comparison to them. They wouldn't be doing this if they weren't planning on putting this feedback to good use for the production of future shows. The studio wants to bring back elements from older shows that have been lost during the transition to new generation, but they can't do that all at once. Blazar was only possible as a next step because shows like Zet, Trigger, and Decker were as successful as they were. Tsubura has been giving the rest of the world a chance to support them through their international releases these past couple of years, pushing the bounds for tokusatsu accessibility even further through their simuldub and multilingual subbed uploads of Zet and Blazar to their YouTube channel. Do not place your faith in corporate overlords like Bandai. Instead, believe in the creatives that are earnestly trying to push the series into new heights, incorporating the best parts of both old and new. There's still so much further that Ultraman can go. We just need to give them a chance.